Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are thrilled to be back with you as we present Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in Healthcare, part two of our two-part series. I'm here this evening with Dr. Ebony Caldwell, and she is the System Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Rochester Regional Health. She is a transformative leader that has dedicated over a decade of her career to organizational change and strategic planning with an intentional focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her career includes work in law enforcement, politics, academia, community, and consulting. Dr. Caldwell engages in critical conversations to examine, uncover, and address historic and structural inequities. She works from the philosophy of diversity is a benefit, equity is a goal, and inclusion is the ongoing practice. She has led cross-divisional committees, task force, and leadership advisory boards to align commitment, vision, and results. In this work, she has cultivated the ability to garner the support of colleagues and embrace the gray areas as opportunities for growth. Dr. Caldwell received her bachelor's and master's degree in psychology from Medallic University and a doctorate in executive leadership from St. John Fisher University. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague and someone that I have worked with and has learned a lot from over the years, Dr. Ebony Caldwell. This session is entitled Bias.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stamps. I'm so excited to be here for part two of a six-part series. And we're going to briefly go over the objectives again, which are the same for the entire series. We're going to define and level set on common language, which we did last time about and how to promote DEI initiatives. We're going to discuss bias and racism to understand the impact on healthcare. And that's what we're going to do a deep dive into bias tonight. And then identify concepts and strategies to mitigate bias and eradicate disparities, as well as develop a toolbox for leaders to address bias and foster a culture of allyship. So tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about what is bias. We're going to talk about the many types of bias, the sources and the impact of bias, as well as some bias traps we need to watch out for, and then some strategies and resources to mitigate bias. And then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So bear with me for a moment and kind of get yourself centered and listen to the story and think about the question, how can this be? A father and son were involved in a car accident in which the father was killed and the son was seriously injured. The father was pronounced dead at the scene of the accident, and his body was taken to the local morgue. The son was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into emergency room. A surgeon was called. Upon arrival, seeing the patient, the attending surgeon explained, "Oh my God, it's my son." So how can this be? Let me know your thoughts in the chat. How can this be? What do we think? Okay. Have some answers rolling in. Great. Okay, yeah. For some people, the association between surgeon and men is so strong that it interferes with our problem solving and making an accurate judgment. But we have some people that got it right off the bat, right? So some of you may have gotten the answer right away, and some of you, it took time for others to see it. Either way, this exercise highlights how we all have biases. For instance, did you see the surgeon's gender? You don't have to answer, but kind of think about it in your mind. Did you see the surgeon's gender when I was telling the story? Did you see a certain race when you thought about the surgeon? What about the surgeon's age, right? So we all have biases that come up for us from our own experiences or from what we've seen. That sometimes biases they stand in the way of our judgment. And so, what is bias? Bias is inclinations and preferences that influence our judgment and decisions, which sometimes keeps us from being objective. Bias can be unconscious or it can be conscious. And so I wanted to make sure that we're staying with your glossary of terms for ANNA. And this is how ANNA defines bias. It's an inclination or preference that interferes with impartial judgment. Bias can be positive or negative, and it can be innate or learned. It also is developed for or against individuals, groups, places, or beliefs. I always say there's no shame in this work in talking about bias because we all have bias. If you have a functioning brain, you have bias. In pre-evolutionary times, it was a survival skill. So if we were in the woods hunting and gathering and we heard a twig snap, we didn't wait around to see if it was a brown bunny or a white bunny or a brown bear. We ran so that we could live to fight another day. But as we evolve and advance, we strive to understand and address biases. And this is one of my favorite images of all time. Unconscious bias, so easy, even a caveman can do it, right? So the old Geico commercial, it doesn't take much thought to have bias because it is the way our brain works. There is no neutrality in the work of bias. We can only have a greater or lesser awareness of our biases. And when we have that greater awareness, that is when we can begin to collect tools to mitigate it. There's also a paradox to bias. Everyone has bias of one sort or another. And while there definitely are some dangers in yielding to our biases, sometimes if we acknowledge the paradox of bias, bias can be useful, right? It helps us quickly categorize our environments to assess them, but it can also hurt us. Bias can be dangerous when we are working on missing information, critical information, and when we're working on assumptions, it could lead to inaccurate decisions. So if bias is not challenged, it can lead to unfair, destructive, and counterproductive actions. So there are many types of biases. You might think that regardless of what I've shared so far, that most people still believe they're rational and logical. But we are always under the influence of bias, which distorts our thinking, impacts our beliefs, and sways our decisions. And so here are 3 types of biases that I want to share today. The first one is stereotype, which is a fixed overall generalization, assumptions about a particular group or class of people. So how many of you have heard all women are bad drivers? You've heard that sometime, and it assumes that women are bad drivers, and the flip side of it is that men are good drivers, right? But we know that can be mixed. There could be some bad women drivers and some bad men who drive badly, and then there are women who drive well, right? There's also the stereotype about older people struggle with technology. That could be true, but it's not the whole story, right? Another type of bias that we want to review today is microaggressions, and those are everyday slights and snubs or insults. One that comes to mind is, I believe the most qualified person should get the job. So if we strip that down and we think about that statement, well, doesn't everyone want the most qualified person to get the job? But it usually comes up when we talk about diverse candidates, right? And we want to make sure that we're not making diversity synonymous with unqualified. So when we say that, it's a little bit of a slight or snub in there. The other thing is, everyone can succeed in this society if they work hard enough. Well, that may be true for some groups, but it's not necessarily true for others. And it negates that other experience when we say everyone can succeed. Or the other side of that is, if you're not succeeding, you haven't worked hard. And is the slight or snub. And then the final one here today that we're going to talk about, the type of bias, is unconscious or implicit bias, and they're the same thing. And it's that automatic preference or judgment in favor of or against a thing, person, place, or group. And a couple of examples here is, he's from Appalachia, so of course he isn't very well educated. Or the story about the diversity practitioner who gets on the plane, sees a female pilot, and is excited about it. But once you hit turbulence, she says, I hope she knows how to drive this thing. She's never had that thought, unconscious or conscious, about a male when there was a male pilot. And so these are the types of biases that we wanted to review today. Can you think of any biases, that types of biases or examples of these three that you've seen or heard or experienced? And if you have, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll refer back to them in just a bit. So any examples of stereotypes that you've heard, microaggressions, or unconscious bias examples? So we were going to show a video, but technology is not my friend today. So what we're going to do is, I encourage you to watch this video at your leisure. You can Google it, or I do believe that ANNA will send it out to you as a resource. It's The Danger of a Single Story, which is a TED Talk video by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She is a Nigerian native and author, and she talks about in this video stereotypes, and she discusses how she's had single stories about others and how others have had single stories about her. Her story illustrates how sometimes we use limited information to make very broad assumptions about people, groups, and values. Her story also helps us understand the importance of broadening our perspectives and moving beyond preconceived notions. And one of the quotes in the video that resonates with me is when she says, it's not that single stereotypes are untrue, it's that they're incomplete and they make that one story the only story. And so it begs us to expand our stories and really get to know people, and not hang on the one thing that we've heard about them from our history or from the media or from fill in the blank, right? And so we really need to broaden our perspectives and move beyond our preconceived notions. And that will allow us to find common ground, and as well as increase humanity and dignity for our patients and our colleagues. Microaggressions in everyday life. There's a book by Daryl Wing Sue, and it's called Microaggressions in Everyday Life. And the more you get to understand biases, your own as well as the ones that you are a part of in your organizations or in your community, you will see them in everyday life. And there's two quickly that I wanted to share with you here. The first one is the companion with patient. So how many of you have gone to a doctor's appointment with an older relative or a friend just to be a second set of eyes or ears? And when you're in the doctor's office, the doctor or the nurse or even the tech is talking to you rather than to the patient, because the patient is older. There is a microaggression in that, as they think the older person doesn't understand, or the older person may need your approval or may need you to make the decisions for them. And so we want to make sure that we understand that that's a microaggression and how to handle it. I use nonverbal, and when I took my aunt to the doctor and the doctor was looking at me, I just turned my gaze to my aunt, and then the provider's eyes would follow to my aunt rather than, having the conversation with me. Or I've heard a lot of people say, "Hey, I just say, can you address my mom, or can you address my dad? He is an active participant in his care." Whatever it is, we want to try and notice those microaggressions, and whenever possible, we want to be able to correct them in the moment in a respectful way. The other one is post office. I was in the post office sending I don't know, a package or something. And what happened was there was a older gentleman in front of me who spoke Spanish, and the person behind the counter did not. Every interaction, every sentence or exchange with the older gentleman and the person behind the counter, the person behind the counter got more aggressive and got louder. And it wasn't that the older gentleman couldn't hear, but it was that he didn't speak English and she didn't speak Spanish. And so that's microaggression number one in that interaction. The second part of it was there was another gentleman, there was a woman in line who just decided out of the goodness of her heart she would start translating for the gentleman so he could get what he needed. And then there was a guy behind the translator who said, "If you don't mind me asking, do you you don't look like you are someone who speaks Spanish. How do you learn to speak Spanish so well?" Well, she was very open and said both of my parents are from Puerto Rico, and he thanked her for sharing that with him. Do we think that second interaction was a microaggression? You can put yes, thumbs up, thumbs down. What do we think? Was that second interaction in the post office line microaggression? Okay, maybe. Yes, yes. Okay. All right. So it very well could have been a microaggression, but because the translator was very willing to answer and didn't take offense to it, it became a teachable moment for everyone in line or everyone in earshot. Because if you look at the top of this slide, it says sender, receiver, and observer. And those are the three components of a microaggression. So the sender is the person who commits the microaggression. The receiver is the person who the microaggression was directed toward. And then the observer is anyone in earshot. But in this situation in the post office, the woman was not offended, and the gentleman realized that maybe he asked the question wrong, or he maybe shouldn't have asked the question. And so he thanked her for sharing the information. So it turned out to be it turned out to be a teachable moment for everyone in line. Actions of the receiver and sender, we always want to leave room for growth. So the translator could have been very angry, and she could have snapped at the man in line, but that wouldn't have helped him understand the microaggression, and it wouldn't have met him where he was, because maybe it really was a mistake on his part, or just ignorance. He just really didn't know and wanted the information. And so we want to make sure that we're giving people the opportunity and room for growth to learn, but also we can push back a little and realize that it's not our job to teach everyone everything about us, right? They can do some of the work on their own. We want to also remember that microaggressions can apply to all in one group. When we say things like, how those patients are, or it can imply a judgment when we say things like they won't understand or be able to comply with fill in the blank. And then microaggressions are also fairly inflexible. When we have statements like, "You don't look like you should be a nurse leader," or like you could be a nurse leader, right? And so we want to make sure that whenever we're talking and interacting, We are inclusive of all groups. We're not implying judgment or placing judgment, and we want to be as flexible as possible to avoid microaggressions. Unconscious bias are those hidden beliefs. Remember, I said bias can be conscious or unconscious. But I want to talk a little bit about unconscious bias here. Those are the hidden beliefs that kind of ruminate in the back of your mind, and they come from the people that you've been around, the places that you've been, and the situations you've been a part of. And they come out when you least expect it, and they color your perceptions and your responses. And all of that comes from different sources. The sources of our bias are vast and widespread, but the impact of bias is a little bit more straightforward. And so the sources of our bias come from personal and professional experiences. It comes from the information we consume in books, news, movies, and social media. It comes from the educational establishments that we are a part of and the subjects and majors we've chosen to study. It also comes from the culture of our community or society and the unspoken and tacit rules within them. If we think about discourse, the words we use and how we use them, it allows people into a group or it keeps them out of a group. Think about academia. Think about the legal field or even the medical field. We use a lot of jargon and acronyms that keep people in a community or out of the community. Another source of bias is the context in which we couch certain situations or our worldview, our family, friends, and people we choose to spend time with. And then finally, it comes from our innate traits that we are born with and that are familiar to us. But as I said, the impact of bias is a little bit more straightforward. It falls into three buckets. One is the damaging zone, which no one wants to be in. If we're not aware of our biases, we can make people feel abused, harassed, or slighted. But another one we don't pay enough attention to is the limiting zone. And this comes from Franklin Covey's lessons on bias. The limiting zone is, with no malice intended, if we're not working on our biases, we can make people feel ignored or tolerated. And I don't know about you, but I never want to feel ignored or tolerated in the workplace or in my community. But if we are working on our biases, we are aware of them, and we're doing the work to mitigate them, we can make people feel valued, respected, and included. And no matter where we fall on this continuum, on this in these buckets today, we have the capacity and responsibility to be moving toward that high performance zone. Feelings induce bias. So if we're stressed about our patient load, if we have anxiety about leadership changes, if we're tired and we have fatigue due to long shifts and nursing shortages, or we're fearful regarding personal or professional situations, we lean into biases we didn't even realize we had. And so I think it pairs well with the Gandhi quote: if we watch our words, because they become our behaviors become our habits, and our habits become our values. And so we really need to understand our biases so that even in these stressful times, we are able to do the work to mitigate them. We're going to share a few bias traps today. These are patterns or tendencies that we fall into when we are in certain situations and we're working from a narrow lens. And it reminds me of that Sesame Street song when we were kids. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things does not belong. The activity or song's purpose was to teach children to group, categorize, or match. And just like in previous slides, we have to understand the paradox of grouping and matching and keeping things together, and then increase our awareness of this, and then address the bias that comes from it. And there are so many bias traps: anchoring bias, in-group bias, negativity bias, attribution bias, sunk costs, and so many others. But we're just going to review a few today. The first one we're going to review is affinity bias. And so it's a preference for people who are similar to or have the same qualities as you do or ourselves, right? So birds of a feather flock together, but unfortunately, the duck is not a part of this group, but they might have something different, but it's a skill that you need. So when we think about maybe we are transplant nurses and we think, oh, we're transplant nurses, we do it this way, but then those home dialysis people, they do it that way. Or we have the outpatient processes and practices, but then there's acute care processes that are different. We can all learn something from one another. And then I see this a lot in my work, the new versus the veteran nurses. So really looking at this bias and seeing how we do sometimes do that, right? It's like we said, we all have biases. And when we are staying in our groups and staying with people who are similar or have same qualities as us, let's see how we can step out of that trap and see the good in something different and add it to our groups to mitigate affinity bias. Another bias trap is confirmation bias. And so it's a tendency to stick with what we already know and not let any new information in. Nice little cartoon here that illustrates it perfectly is it's a stick figure that says, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides, time to do the research and find out the real truth. And do a quick Google search, and literally the first thing that pops up that confirms what they already believe is where they stop, jackpot. But we know when we do a Google search, there's so much that comes up when you do a search, like 20 things on the first page. And if we only stop at the first one or the one that coincides with what we believe, we're missing a whole lot of information. And so I usually talk about internal versus external hires. I know Deb is a great nurse. I know that she's wonderful with the patient, goes the extra mile, doesn't mind working extra shifts, but I don't know anything else about the other person coming in. And so I shut out all that information and we could lose some great talent that way. And then the last bias trap is halo versus form. Halo is when we have a positive first impression of someone that leads us to overlook their negative characteristics and treat them more favorably than others. And then horns is when we have a negative first impression of someone that leads us to concentrate only on their negative aspects of their behavior and not treat them as well as we should. So this makes me think of patient handoff. We had a difficult patient. She had horns, and so when Deb comes on shift, I'm going to tell her just how bad patient in room 300 was, and she should watch out for her, right? But maybe I had a good impression, and Celeste tells me that she had a great impression of the patient in room 200. And then I go into that patient, and that's how I see them, either in the negative or the positive way that that impression has put upon me. It's also when we think about skill sets in our nurses and skills we see or don't see, when we think about associates versus baccalaureate or master's prepared nurses, we think, if you're bachelor's or master's prepared, you got a halo, but if you're an associate, you have the horns. And then we kind of stick with our impressions of that, and we don't treat our nurses or our colleagues as favorable as we should. And so thinking about those bias traps, the work is to understand our biases and how we fall into these traps, and then do the work to avoid them. Some strategies before we go, we want to share, or before we open it up for questions, we want to share a few strategies and resources to help mitigate bias. And the first one is intent versus impact is one way to show up and engage and grow every day. Intent centers on the individual, and I always say me, and impact centers on others, which is we. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on a we, right? We want to come outside of ourselves and think about others and what is an affirming alternative to what we've said. The other way to look at intent versus impact is what you think you said is not what they heard. So the lines of communication are down or broken. So we want to be aware of our intent and own our impact, okay? And then this one I love, remember the sources and impacts of bias. The way we see people from media, books, family history, national origin, etc., is the way we treat them. So we need to do the work to recognize our biases and apply the strategies to mitigate them, right? And here's another one. It will be in the resources as well. Implicit association test. Over 1 million people have taken this test, which speaks to its reliability and validity. And results confirm no matter your location, age, gender, race, or ethnicity, everyone has unconscious bias and prejudices regarding many cultural and social identities. We encourage you to take the test. Don't be surprised by your results. Everyone has bias. This gives you a starting point to begin your greater awareness. And here's a quick exercise that allows us to actively practice reducing our personal biases. So be aware of your bias. That's the one thing you need to reflect, understand where you are on this DEI journey. Actively think about a bias that you hold and how it plays out. You want to question yourself and others. Am I rushing to judgment or am I working on opinion or fact? Cultivate connections outside of your existing circles so that you can encourage dialogue, engage in dialogue, and have that desire to understand others. And so, quick summary of what we covered today before we open up for questions. Overcoming bias. A lot of people, I don't think, understand what bias work is, right? And it's not about changing your personal beliefs or eliciting guilt or condemning or criticizing individuals or even debating the impact of racism and or bias on behaviors and decisions. But what it is about is setting clear expectations, affirming all cultures and identities to build an inclusive and welcoming environment for all. And most importantly, it's about being aware that we all bring our history with us and that history matters. And so, Dr. Stamps, I have covered my material. I'm going to open it up for questions and I'll let you facilitate that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Caldwell. I always learn something new, and this work is always evolving. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me see if there's anything in the chat. Please feel free to ask any questions, clarifications. We thank you for being with us this evening. No questions.
Okay.
Has anyone taken the Harvard implicit bias assessment already? Great information. Thank you from our national president. Thank you for joining. Okay. Oh, there's another. I like the notion of acknowledging our biases and not trying to deny them. Absolutely. We all have them. No matter how hard we try. It's when we acknowledge them to know that they cannot impact, for instance, the care that we give our patients or the environment that we create to have an inclusive, welcoming environment of our colleagues, so that people feel free to speak up and be, have a voice at the table. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that quote where it says there's no neutrality in this work, right? You have to have an awareness or you don't. When you have the awareness, that's when you can do the work to mitigate.
It is 7:34. We're going to bring this to conclusion. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Caldwell. I truly appreciate your partnership on this education journey for our organization. And
We
just to
have
remind everyone, oh, go ahead.
Nope. I just wanted to remind folks about the resources. Those really do help further your awareness. And it allows you to process some of the things that, like in 30 minutes, it's hard to process everything. So we encourage you to write down your questions. We have 4 more modules and would love to hear, we can always circle back to something that you may want to bring up.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Well, again, thank you all very much. Please have a wonderful, safe holiday, and we will see you in the new year.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.